Welcome back. If you missed the first episode, perish the thought, I wanted to fill you in on a few things. First, my name is Heather Ordover. I normally host the podcast Craftlit and lately the video podcast Craftlit as well. We just finished the book Emma, which was charming and lovely and wonderful, and we finished it a little bit before the election, and then the election happened. So here I am. In 1792, a book was published in London that firmly stated that true freedom for everybody requires equality between women and men. That doesn't sound like much, but truly, this book of hers rocked the world at the time and has continued to influence thinkers ever since. Her writing is kind of like an old school Lin-Manuel Miranda. The way he references and mixes different styles and influences in Hamilton, she's doing the same thing in this text. She's pulling quotes and ideas from all over the place: philosophy, religion, politics, essays, poems, popular books, everything. So if you come across something that you think pings your brain and you think, oh, that sounds familiar, you're probably right. She is referencing someone or something that you might know about. So pat yourself on the back when that happens. Good job. If you aren't used to the kind of language that's used in a document from 1792, please give yourself 5 or 10 minutes. Just let the words kind of wash over you. You'll get there, and no one can see you rewind. So no sweat. Even famous Shakespearean actors have to do this when they go see Shakespeare themselves. So it's just not fair to expect our brains to be able to handle this big a switch in our language on a whim. So please be kind to yourself. And English teachers, please be kind to your students about this too. So in any book from 1792, are we going to hear outdated language? Oh yes, absolutely. Some of it will be jarring, and some of it won't make sense at all because we live in a different contextual world from her, and that's what I'm here for. I will help. But instead of front-loading each episode with audio Cliffs Notes for you like I do on Craftlit, I'm putting those notes on the screen at the bottom, underneath where you'll see me and the text from the actual book. If you are reading the captions, you can actually read the text with your eyes while I'm reading it with my mouth. Then no one can tell you didn't actually read it. I have a few notes for you. Any capitalization you see in those captions in her text are all hers. Any italics or extra things that you see are mine, although she does occasionally add a footnote. If you see a footnote, that is 100% her. And if you notice strange punctuation, like there is no way there's a period there, you are correct. In order for me to get the app that I use to edit these videos to break the text of the book up in a way that would help you make sense of it and help, honestly, me make sense of it as well, I had to put periods where they didn't belong just to get the text to break across screens. So I apologize. It's driving me nuts. I can't figure out a way to fix it. Just know that this is true and walk on by. Some highlights and rules for the road. Things to know about the kind of terminology that you may hear, and well, honestly, we'll definitely hear in at least the first episodes. The first, Islam was not something that people knew much about in France or England at this time. As a consequence, Mary Wollstonecraft uses a term like Mohammedanism to describe Islam, and this is absolutely factually incorrect. Muslims do not worship Muhammad, so calling them Mohammedans or anything like that, that was very old school and very not done any longer. It's a huge misunderstanding of how religion worked based on a Christian society that saw Islam from afar. However, there's other stuff going on too. If you read the book Orientalism by Edward Said, I think it came out in 1978, you'll see that he looks at the way that European and American cultures have historically shown Asian, Middle Eastern, and North African societies in a way that makes them purposefully look exotic and mysterious, and it definitely others them. And in explaining Orientalism, he points out that it is a way for the West to both see and describe the East as outdated and uncivilized. And I think this is important, in particular, describes those societal centers as being in need of help from the West, so there's that. And this way of thinking obviously creates oversimplified and often really disrespectful images of entire regions and their people. It would be like saying all people from the South are stupid if you live in the North just because you're used to people talking fast and people in the South don't speak so fast. This way of thinking, it's used to justify colonialism. It's used to justify the exploitation of people. So his work in 1978 started an important conversation in post-colonial studies, and it continues to be significant in understanding how power dynamics affect people even today. Power dynamics affect everything, especially cultural representations, but really, seriously, everything in the world today. That said, the vibe that I've gotten from rereading The Vindication of the Rights of Women this time around, because I read it before in school, is that while Mary Wollstonecraft might have been communicating an exotic other in location and culture, she is still pointing out that as lovely and as exotic as the land of Scheherazade may be, Scheherazade is still a prisoner because she's a woman. Other things to note. Mary Wollstonecraft, to her, God is a positive force in the world, not up for discussion. When she talks about virtue, she is not talking about religious virtue. She's not talking about sexual virtue. She's talking about the Enlightenment ideal of the social contract, which women, she is pointing out, are excluded from, and largely still are. We'll get into more of the social contract later, so for now, just file it away as a term that you will know more about when we're done. No sweat. So I'd not expected to be recording this right now. I was going to give myself a break after finishing Emma, but then I woke up on Wednesday and realized that I've been thinking for a long time about the need to really dig into this text from Mary Wollstonecraft because I keep bringing it up, especially when we do Jane Austen. So I do want to make sure you understand, I read this whole thing when I was in college, when I was getting my teaching degree. I have not read the whole thing since. And because of the surprise timing of all of this, I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing through again yet. I'm keeping a chapter or two ahead of what I'm recording. So there is every chance that as I go along in this, I'm going to start correcting myself or at least expanding on some notes that I give you in earlier episodes. To me, that's just kind of the natural progression of things. It's like with all sciences, it's a process. You learn, you change your hypothesis, you move along. If you are watching in real time with me and have something to say that you think will help positively influence somebody's understanding of this text as we move along, please do put that kind of comment in the comments below. And especially if you would, could you write the word question in all caps so that I can see that it's a question instead of a comment? Then I can get to those questions right away and use them in future episodes. If you have a clarification, something that I said or misspoke about or got close to but didn't really get completely right, please write clarification in all caps and then tell me what I needed to clarify, because then I can read that or show those on the screen when I do the next episode as well. I don't want to get this wrong. I do want to get this right. But mostly, I just needed to get this out. Today, we will listen to and read the actual introduction that Mary Wollstonecraft wrote to her book, A Vindication on the Rights of Women. Right, here we go. Introduction. After considering the historic page and viewing the living world with anxious solicitude, the most melancholy emotions of sorrowful indignation have depressed my spirits, and I have sighed when obliged to confess that either nature has made a great difference between man and man, or that the civilization which has hitherto taken place in the world has been very partial. I've turned over various books written on the subject of education and patiently observed the conduct of parents in the management of schools. But what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the grand source of the misery I deplore, and that women in particular are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state, for like the flowers that are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness get sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade, disregarded, on the stalk long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. One cause of this barren blooming I attribute to a false system of education gathered from the books written on this subject by men who, considering females as women rather than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than rational wives. And the understanding of the sex has been so bubbled by this specious homage that the civilized woman of the present century, with a few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition and by their abilities and virtues exact respect. In a treatise, therefore, on female rights and manners, the works which have been particularly written for their improvement must not be overlooked, especially when it is asserted in direct terms that the minds of women are enfeebled by false refinement, and that the books of instruction written by men of genius have the same tendency as more frivolous productions, and that in the true style of Mohammedanism, they are only considered as females and not as a part of the human species, when improvable reason is allowed to be the dignified distinction which raises men above the brute creation and puts a natural scepter in that feeble hand. Yet, because I am a woman, I would not lead my readers to suppose that I mean violently to agitate the contested question respecting the equality inferiority of the sex. But, as the subject lies in my way, and I cannot pass it over without subjecting the main tendency of my reasoning to misconstruction, I shall stop a moment to deliver in a few words my opinion. In the government of the physical world, it is observable that the female, in general, is inferior to the male. The male pursues, the female yields. This is the law of nature, and it does not appear to be suspended or abrogated in favor of woman. This physical superiority cannot be denied, and it is a noble prerogative. But, not content with this natural preeminence, men endeavor to sink us still lower, merely to render us alluring objects for a moment. And women, intoxicated by the adoration which men, under the influences of their senses, pay them, do not seek to obtain a durable interest in their hearts, or to become the friends of the fellow creatures who find amusement in their society. I am aware of an obvious inference. From every quarter I have heard exclamations against masculine women. But where are they to be found? If by this appellation men mean to inveigh against their ardor in hunting, shooting, and gaming, I shall most cordially join the cry. But if it be against the imitation of manly virtues, or, more properly speaking, the attainment of those talents and virtues, the exercise of which ennobles the human character and which raise females in the scale of animal being, when they are comprehensively termed mankind, all those who view them with a philosophical eye must, I should think, wish with me that they may every day grow more and more masculine. This discussion naturally divides the subject, so I shall first consider women in the grand light of human creatures, who, in common with men, are placed on this earth to unfold their faculties, and afterwards I shall more particularly point out their peculiar designation. I wish also to steer clear of an error which many respectable writers have fallen into, for the instruction which has hitherto been addressed to women has rather been applicable to ladies, if the little indirect advice that is scattered through Sandford and Merton be accepted. But addressing my sex in a firmer tone, I pay particular attention to those in the middle class, because they appear to be in the most natural state. Perhaps the seeds of false refinement, immorality, and vanity have ever been shed by the great. Weak, artificial beings raised above the common wants and affections of their race in a premature, unnatural manner, undermine the very foundation of virtue and spread corruption through the whole mass of society. As a class of mankind, they have the strongest claim to pity. The education of the rich tends to render them vain and helpless, and the unfolding mind is not strengthened by the practice of those duties which dignify the human character. They only live to amuse themselves, and by the same law which in nature invariably produces certain effects, they soon only afford barren amusement. But as I propose taking a separate view of the different ranks of society and of the moral character of women, in each, this hint is, for the present, sufficient. And I have only alluded to the subject because it appears to me to be the very essence of an introduction to give a cursory account of the contents of the work it introduces. My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out in what true dignity and human happiness consists. I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength both of mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness. Dismissing then those pretty feminine phrases which the men condescendingly use to soften our slavish dependence, and despising that weak elegancy of mind, exquisite sensibility, and sweet docility of manners, supposed to be the sexual characteristics of the weaker vessel, I wish to show that elegance is inferior to virtue, that the first object of laudable ambition is to obtain a character as a human being, regardless of the distinction of sex, and that secondary views should be brought to this simple touchstone. This is a rough sketch of my plan. And I should express my conviction with the energetic emotions that I feel whenever I think of this subject. The dictates of experience and reflection will be felt by some of my readers. Animated by this important object, I shall disdain to cull my phrases or polish my style. I aim at being useful, and sincerity will render me unaffected for wishing rather to persuade by the force of my arguments than dazzle by the elegance of my language. I shall not waste my time in rounding periods, nor in fabricating the turgid bombast of artificial feelings which, coming from the head, never reach the heart. I shall be employed about things, not words, and anxious to render my sex more respectable members of society, I shall try to avoid that flowery diction which is slided from essays into novels, and from novels into familiar letters and conversation. These pretty nothings, these caricatures of the real beauty of sensibility, dropping glibly from the tongue, vitiate the taste and create a kind of sickly delicacy that turns away from simple, unadorned truth. And a deluge of false sentiments and overstretched feelings, stifling the natural emotions of the heart, render the domestic pleasures insipid that ought to sweeten the exercise of those severe duties which educate a rational and immortal being for a nobler field of action. The educate of women has of late been more attended to than formerly, yet they are still reckoned a frivolous sex and ridiculed or pitied by the writers who endeavor by satire or instruction to improve them. It is acknowledged that they spend many of the first years of their lives in acquiring a smattering of accomplishments. Meanwhile, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty, to the desire of establishing themselves the only way women can rise in the world, by marriage. And this desire, making mere animals of them when they marry, they act as such children may be expected to act. They dress, they paint, and nickname God's creatures. Surely, those weak beings are only fit for the seraglio. Can they govern a family or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world? If, then, it can be fairly deduced from the present conduct of the sex, from the prevalent fondness for pleasure, which takes the place of ambition and those nobler passions that open and enlarge the soul, that the instruction which women have received has only tended, with the constitution of civil society, to render them insignificant objects of desire, mere propagators of fools. If it can be proved that in aiming to accomplish them without cultivating their understandings, they are taken out of their sphere of duties and made ridiculous and useless when the short-lived bloom of beauty is over, I presume that rational men will excuse me for endeavoring to persuade them to become more masculine and respectable. Footnote. A lively writer, I cannot recollect his name, asks what business women turned of 40 have to do in the world. Indeed, the word masculine is only a bugbear. There is little reason to fear that women will acquire too much courage or fortitude, for their apparent inferiority with respect to bodily strength must render them in some degree dependent on men in the various relations of life. But why should it be increased by prejudices that give a sex to virtue and confound simple truths with sensual reveries? Women are, in fact, so much degraded by mistaken notions of female excellence that I do not mean to add a paradox when I assert that this artificial weakness produces a propensity to tyrannize and gives birth to cunning, the natural opponent of strength, which leads them to play off those contemptible, infantile airs that undermine esteem, even whilst they excite desire. Do not foster these prejudices, and they will naturally fall into their subordinate yet respectable station in life. It seems scarcely necessary to say that I now speak of my sex in general. Many individuals have more sense than their male relatives, and as nothing preponderates where there is a constant struggle for an equilibrium without it has naturally more gravity, some women govern their husbands without degrading themselves, because intellect will always govern. Actually, you know what? We had an Emma episode not too long ago called The Key, where I shared some research that I found on a pun that was used by Mr. Weston in the Box Hill scene, the very famous Box Hill scene. If you're familiar with Emma, it's the little how do you find perfection game. It's M, and get it? Emma. Well, it wasn't just a cute little joke. It's actually a sub-reference that Jane Austen is making to a whole philosophical conversation that was happening during Jane Austen's lifetime, and specifically during Mary Wollstonecraft's lifetime. And some philosophers, especially a particular one in Scotland, Hutcheson, he in particular was trying to come up with a formula to calculate virtue. Kind of like in some ways conversations that you would have heard with on The Good Place. So yeah, this was the thing. Virtue. The virtue thing was a thing. But it is not like virtue signaling we hear about and talk about and see all the time today. Watch the Emma video. It'll make more sense, and I'll link to it below with a time code embedded, so it'll jump right to that section. I hate this part. It feels so tacky, but here we go. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, support. You know the drill. All the links and information you might possibly need are in the show notes below. And thank you.